The Twilight Zone is one of the most important shows in television history because it completely changed the way people thought about storytelling on TV and helped shape modern pop culture in ways that are still seen today. Created by Rod Serling in 1959, The Twilight Zone wasn't just a science fiction or horror show. It was a show about society, human nature, and the big questions no one else was asking on TV at the time. Back in the 1950s, most TV shows were light comedies or safe dramas that didn't challenge audiences too much. But Serling, who was already an award-winning writer, was frustrated with how much censorship he faced when trying to talk about racism, war, or social issues in his earlier scripts. So he came up with a creative way to talk about those topics, without censors realizing it, by setting them in space, in the future, or in strange imaginary worlds. Each episode of The Twilight Zone was a self-contained story with new characters and a surprising twist at the end. And almost every story taught a moral lesson about greed, prejudice, power, or fear. The show's famous opening was Serling's voice inviting viewers into a dimension, not only of sight and sound, but of mind, instantly set the mood. What makes The Twilight Zone so important to pop culture is not just that it told cool, weird stories, but that it dared to use science fiction, fantasy, and horror to reflect real-world problems. At a time when America was facing Cold War fears, civil rights struggles, and questions about technology and humanity, The Twilight Zone showed people those fears in a way they could understand, without directly attacking anyone. For example, episodes like The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street showed how easily ordinary people could turn against each other in fear and paranoia, reflecting the fears of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Others, like The Eye of the Beholder, tackle the pressure to conform and society's cruel standards of beauty. These messages weren't just entertaining, they were thought-provoking and stayed with audiences long after the show ended. The Twilight Zone also helped launch the careers of many famous actors and writers. People like Robert Redford, William Shatner, and even directors like Richard Donner worked on the show before becoming big names. Writers like Charles Beaumont and Richard Matheson also helped to shape the show's tone, creating stories that balance science fiction thrills with deep emotional questions. Beyond the show's original run, which lasted 5 seasons from 1959 to 1964, its impact on pop culture kept growing. The Twilight Zone became the blueprint for so many shows and movies that followed. Shows like Black Mirror, Stranger Things, The X-Files, and even The Simpsons owe a huge debt to the Twilight Zone's blend of moral storytelling and genre twists. Black Mirror, in particular, feels like a modern version of the Twilight Zone, using technology instead of aliens to explore how people's choices can destroy their lives. Even the famous Simpsons Halloween specials, The Treehouse of Horror, have done direct parodies of Twilight Zone episodes. The phrase Twilight Zone itself has become a part of everyday language. People now use it to describe strange, surreal situations, whether they're talking about weird news stories or personal experiences that felt unsettling. That shows how deeply the series entered the public's imagination. The Twilight Zone didn't just change television storytelling, it changed the way people thought about science fiction. Before Serling's show, a lot of sci-fi was seen as childish or silly, mostly focused on space battles and monsters. But The Twilight Zone proved that science fiction could be thoughtful, artistic, and serious. It showed that you could tell important, emotional stories using robots, aliens, and time travel as symbols for human fears and struggles. This opened the door for future creators to take sci-fi seriously, and use it to tell powerful stories about the world we live in. Star Trek, which debuted a couple of years after The Twilight Zone, clearly borrowed from Serling's idea of using science fiction to explore moral questions. Later, movies like Planet of the Apes, which Serling himself helped write, also carried that same blend of sci-fi adventure and social commentary. The Twilight Zone's storytelling structure also became iconic. The twist endings, the eerie music, and the serious narration all created a distinct style that many other shows tried to copy. It helped popularize the anthology format, where each episode tells a completely different story. Anthologies had existed before, but The Twilight Zone made them cool again, inspiring later anthologies like Tales from the Crypt, Amazing Stories, and more recently, American Horror Story. The influence of The Twilight Zone isn't just found in TVs and movies. It also inspired writers, musicians, and even game designers. Stephen King has often said that watching The Twilight Zone as a child helped to shape his love of horror and weird fiction. Musicians from Rush to Golden Earring reference the show in their lyrics. Even video games like BioShock and Fallout have a certain Twilight Zone feel, with eerie worlds and moral choices that change the outcome of the story. What's also interesting is how the Twilight Zone made Rod Serling himself a pop culture icon. Most showrunners stayed behind the scenes, but Serling was the face and voice of his show. His calm, serious introductions became part of the experience, and his writing style was so distinctive that people could tell the Serling script from a mile away. He cared deeply about what his story said, and he wasn't afraid to challenge his audience to think deeper about what it means to be human. That's a big reason why the show still holds up today. Even though the special effects are dated and the acting styles are from a different era, the themes are timeless. The fears about war, technology, conformity, and prejudice are still relevant, and the way the Twilight Zone explored them still feels smart and fresh. Over the years, the Twilight Zone has been rebooted several times, including a 1980s version, a short-lived early 2000s reboot, and more recently, a reboot hosted by Jordan Peele. Each version tried to capture the spirit of Serling's original, but none quite reached the same cultural impact. Still, the fact that people keep trying shows how powerful the original series was. Beyond the reboots, the Twilight Zone has become part of pop culture traditions. In the US, channels like Sci-Fi run Twilight Zone marathons every New Year's Eve and 4th of July, introducing new generations to the classic episodes. It's a rare example of a show from the 1950s that's still regularly watched and quoted today. The Twilight Zone also showed that TV could be art. At a time when many people saw television as a low form of entertainment, Serling proved that TV writers could ask big questions and challenge audiences to think. In many ways, he paved the way for more serious TV dramas that came later, like The Sopranos, Breaking Bad, and The Wire. Even though those shows aren't science fiction, they followed Serling's lead in treating television as a medium for complex, thoughtful storytelling. The Twilight Zone also explored the darker side of humanity. Unlike most shows of its time, not every episode had a happy ending. In fact, many ended with a character being punished for their flaws, or trapped in a terrible situation of their own making. This wasn't common on TV back then, but it reflected a more honest view of the world, where actions have consequences and people aren't always rescued at the last minute. That honest, sometimes cynical view of human nature influenced the tone of later science fiction, especially in movies like Blade Runner, The Terminator, and The Matrix, where the future isn't always bright and perfect. Another reason The Twilight Zone became so important is that it appealed to both casual viewers and deep thinkers. You could enjoy the stories just as weird, spooky entertainment, but if you paid attention, you realized they were asking tough questions about life, death, justice, and humanity's future. This balance of entertainment and philosophy is something a few shows pull off, and it's part of why The Twilight Zone has lasted so long in people's memories. The legacy of The Twilight Zone lives on in how we use stories today to reflect our fears and hopes. Whether it's new sci-fi shows, dystopian movies, or even viral YouTube shorts, storytellers continue to use strange, imaginary settings to talk about real-life problems, just like Rod Serling did. The Twilight Zone taught creators that sometimes the best way to tell the truth is through fiction. It showed that you could shine a light on real-world injustice by putting it on an alien planet or in a distant future. It also proved that audiences are smart enough to get the message, even when it's wrapped in a weird supernatural story. In the end, The Twilight Zone isn't just an old TV show with black and white episodes and spooky music. It's a piece of television history that changed the way stories are told on screen. It made science fiction meaningful, gave TV writers a platform to challenge their audiences, and inspired countless artists across generations. Its influence is everywhere, whether we realize it or not. So, next time you see a story with a twist ending, a dystopian future, or a moral warning wrapped in science fiction, you're probably seeing a little bit of The Twilight Zone. And that's the true legacy of Rod Serling's creation. A show that dared to ask difficult questions and invite viewers into a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. Like, comment, and subscribe for daily history and culture content.